I don't know if anyone else did this when you were kids or growing up, or maybe even now. I'm not sure, but when I was a kid, and I was born in 1979, so I was growing up in the 80s and early 90s, and so even back then, we had cassette tapes, and we could have players, cassette players, some of which had the function of being able to record. So you just press the play and the red REC button together, and then you could record using the machine. And so you could record sounds, and you could record things, you could record your own voice, etc. And the quality is not like what we know now with recording off of iPhones and that sort of thing, but it was really great for what was available back then. But it was great for someone like me. And what I did was, I also, at the time, as some of you may know, I was watching a lot of horror films, some of which were shown on, say, broadcast TV. So they were edited down for the most part, but it still was really great to watch. And so what I would do for some of them was I would be really into the cadences and rhythms of the speech and a lot of the dialogue. And so what I would do is I would take parts of the film and I would record on a cassette tape. So say I'd go maybe do the opening credits, so I'd get the theme song and I'd record, and then I'd take moments that I thought were key moments of the film and I'd record the dialogue. And so and I'd press record and I'd stop, and then I'd go to another part of the film and I'd press record and stop. So I'd have the stereo or the tape machine close to the speakers of the TV, and so I could get what I would think to be the most optimal quality of sound at the time. And then I created a little mixtape on a cassette, but it wasn't a mixtape of songs, but it was a mixtape of all the bits of dialogue that I thought were really cool, plus the song cues and the music cues in a film that I thought were really cool. And I did this for a lot of films, and recently a discussion of the film Hellraiser came up, and so I did this with a lot of films. Like I did this with Reanimator, and I also did this with Hellraiser as an example. And I remember those in particular because I had a little dog. We had a family dog. It was a cane terrier. Her name was Maggie. And Maggie barked during bits where I was trying to record these clips off of the TV. And so I don't have the cassette tapes anymore, unfortunately, but I can remember because I listened to them so many times over and over again. I always remember the points where I could hear Maggie's bark, and so that was really nice. But the reason why I did this, I think, was because it was just something to do, I suppose, at the time. I was young, I was a kid, I just wanted to get more and more into this stuff. But now that I think about it, I think it was very valuable for me because what it enabled me to do was I had this mixtape of clips. Say, for example, I did it for Hellraiser 2, Hellbound Hellraiser 2. And so I recorded the first part, the opening credits, and I recorded a little pre-credits bit, and then I did little bits with Dr. Chenard at the beginning, and Tiffany opening the box, and the Cenobites emerging, and then meeting Kirsty again in hell and the labyrinth, and then the reunion with Frank, and then the confrontation with Julia, and then Dr. Chenard and what happens to him and how he becomes Chenard Cenobite, and the revelations about Leviathan, and then the bit with Dr. Chenard confronting the Cenobites and back in the Institute, and then the death of the Cenobites, and then the confrontation between Kirsty and Tiffany, and then Dr. Chenard, and then the end, the resolution, and what is your pleasure, sir? And then the closing credits song. So that was a little bit of a mixtape. So it wasn't that long. It wasn't the entirety of the film, of course, but it was something that I had on a cassette tape, and I could therefore play anywhere that I had a player. And I had an old portable player that I could play, and there were Walkmans as well, so I could listen on a Walkman. And so that was a fun thing to do. It was something that I was able to carry with me. It was portable, and it also meant that I could listen and re-listen and re-listen again to the dialogue, and I thought that, for example, with Hellraiser and Hellbound Hellraiser 2, I thought that the dialogue was some of the strongest parts. I mean, that's one of the strongest parts of those films, is the dialogues. And I don't mean the dialogue just of the Cenobite. So I think the Cenobite dialogue is absolutely out of this world. But I mean also the other dialogue as well. The Dr. Chinar-Julie exchanges I thought are very telling. I love Kirsty's some of her monologues there as well. So, the point I wanted to bring up was, for me as a kid growing up, this allowed me, I think, to really get into the rhythm of the film, and I had to listen a lot, and I think it helped me to identify the highs and lows of the voice raising, of the vocal performances, and to get a sense of the little sounds. I mean, it wasn't the great quality sound that we get nowadays with all this, all these great Blu-rays and stuff. But it was still really good, I think. And my ear got attuned to that kind of quality, which I still love. And so from that, I think. And I did that with a lot of films as well. I did that with, as I mentioned, like Hellraiser, Reanimator, I think Nightmare on Elm Street, and others. But I bring that up because I thought that was such a great, valuable thing. I was so happy that I was able to do this, and I would like listen to it at night. You know, I had a little, as I say, I had a little portable player, and I would just listen to it at night, and sometimes I'd have the volume low. I don't know if I had earphones back at the time or headphones back at the time, but I maybe I didn't, but it was, I listened to it. I remember there were instances where I definitely didn't have headphones, but I was listening to it volume very low, but still very faint, so I could barely make it out, and and that's where I'm able, I think, to just have a real love for specific scenes and the dialogue and the richness of the dialogue. And I just, even now, I get chills listening to that dialogue. So, when Doug Bradley, his delivery is, as you know, immaculate. And in Hellbound Hellraiser 2, when he encounters Kirsty in that film the second time, he says, I love how he says, oh, no boxes. Such a shame, right? And then the other Cenobite says, time. It says time to play, and then Doug Bradley echoes as time to play, right? And then this is the bit where he says, what is it? It is your flesh we want to experience, not your skills at bargaining. Or I should do it in a more British accent. Please, I apologize for my poor British accent, but it should be like, it is your flesh we want to experience, not your skills at bargaining. And then Kirsty goes, no deals, just information. And then Doug Bradley says, go on, but trick us again, child, and your suffering will be legendary even in hell. And then we have a shot of Tiffany focusing in. I think it's on Chatter or Cenobite, I think. But this also, I think, brings up a point about the Hellraiser films, Hellraiser and Hellraiser 2, that I just wanted to figure out, and I don't know if anyone felt the same way or might have a response to this, so I'm not sure. But, in Hellraiser and Hellraiser 2, one of the things about the Kirsty-Cenobite relationship is the idea that in the first film, Kirsty opens the box and she gets a glimpse into hell, and there's the engineer, and she manages to get out, but it's still like a new dimensional thing, and the Cenobites arrive. And then in the first film, if you recall, she makes a deal with the Cenobites, right? And the deal is, as far as I understand it, right, do you know a man called Frank Cotton? And then she says, Cenobite says, oh, yes. And then Kirsty says, he escaped you. And then Doug Bradley's the head Cenobite says, right, nobody escapes us. And he did. I've seen him. Impossible. He's alive. So what if he has escaped us? What has that to do with you? And then the deal by Kirsty is, I can lead you to him and you can take him back instead of me. And then the idea, therefore, is the deal struck, kind of, is, I want to hear him confess himself. Then, maybe. And then the female Cenobite says, but if you cheat. And then he says, we'll tear your soul apart. That's the famous tagline of the film, of course. But therefore, the deal is, if the Cenobites are convinced that what Kirsty is saying is true about how Frank has escaped from the Cenobites and is now out in the real world, and if Kirsty can show them Frank, then the deal is they will take Frank back instead of her. So that's what I thought what the deal was, right? And that's the case, true, in Hellraiser. She shows them Frank. They're convinced it's Frank. They realize it's Frank, right? Because as she says, we had to hear it from your own lips, right? So they take Frank back in a very spectacular fashion, as you know, for those of you who've seen the film. But what do they do after? They still proceed to try to get Kirsty, right? So right, they did say it, right? They didn't quite promise. They said, I want to hear him confess himself. Then maybe. So it wasn't a done deal even at that point. So perhaps there was some room for the Cenobites to essentially get Frank back and then to get Kirsty back. So they could probably argue, if they were to go to court against Kirsty, right? They could probably argue in a court of law that, we didn't actually make a fully pledged promise to Kirsty. We just said that we might consider it. So that's the argument that I think they would make legally. But one could also argue that they did make a contract, an orally established contract, saying that Kirsty would be free if she could give them Frank. So giving them Frank is what in contract law is called the consideration. And so that's that's what I always thought it was. So when they meet again in Hellbound Hellraiser 2, they say, like, they refer to Kirsty's bargaining skills and the like, and I always thought that was really strange, because Kirsty wasn't really necessarily, she gave them what they wanted, and then they in turn wanted to get her as well. So in essence, they were going back on their word, the Cenobites were. And so I always thought that it was the Cenobites who were trying to trick Kirsty rather than the other way around. And it was just through Kirsty's ability in the first film to maneuver the lament configuration in a way to be able to send them back without them capturing her. I thought that was the whole way that she was able to save herself. And so therefore, I always thought it was very curious about the second film, how the Cenobites describe her as being making deals and tricking the Cenobites. But I always thought it was the other way around. And it was Kirsty who was indeed defending herself. Don't get me wrong, I'm a big fan of the films. I love the Cenobite designs, etc. But that sort of thing. But and ultimately, I do understand that there's a sort of a what's the word? A fundamental rule of law when it comes to the opening of the box. So it could be that the Cenobites have to obey this rule of law, even though they might say otherwise. You know what I mean? So the rule of law essentially commands that anyone who opens the box must be succumbed to the whims and scorns of hell, as depicted by Clive Barker in the Cenobites. And so anyone who opens the box is subject to this treatment by the Cenobites. So that's the ironclad rule. That's my understanding. So with that, nothing can break that rule, even Kirsty's attempts to maneuver herself out of it. So maybe in a sense that is what the Cenobites are referring to when they're talking about how she's trying to maneuver herself out of the deal, and she's has skills at bargaining and that sort of thing. So, but when you're opening the lament configuration of the box for the first time, if I were to try to open the box, I wouldn't know what those rules are, and so I'd like to. If I were on the other side, if I were on Kirsty's side, then at the very least I'd like to think that I could hire a good lawyer and sue the Cenobites and bring them to court and at least try to hammer out this argument in a court of law before a judge, hopefully a neutral judge. Maybe if it was a court of law in hell, maybe the judge would be, I don't know, the engineer or Leviathan, I don't know. In that case, I would be very scared as to the chances of my winning. I think I would probably lose such courtroom battle. But in any event, I was always very curious about this aspect of Hellraiser, but I'm a big fan of Hellraiser films. Well, let me take that back. I'm a super fan of Hellraiser and Hellbound Hellraiser 2. As I might have mentioned elsewhere, I always find myself struggling with Hellraiser 3, Hell on Earth. I try to like it, and there are some parts that I think I do, and then I watch the film and I go back. It's a very tough film for me, and it still is. But I do admire what it's trying to do, and I do like. I think the best part of it is the Elliot Spencer aspect. I think that's really great, actually. But for me, it's Hellraiser and Hellbound Hellraiser 2. That is just magnificent stuff. And I do remember also when I first got my hands on the CD soundtrack, the Christopher Young CD soundtrack of Hellbound Hellraiser 2, and it had the picture of the Cenobite standing there kind of at an angle like that. And I heard that soundtrack. That is still to me one of the great CD soundtrack moments of my life. Is that and Star Trek 3, The Search for Spock. Those two soundtracks, when I was able to get those as a kid, those really just, I was so happy. I was so happy to have got that, because that score, I mean, the Hellraiser score is just phenomenal. Hellbound Hellraiser 2 score is so phenomenal as well. And there is a really great, and I was also talking about this with Michelle Kistner in a great conversation that we had. She mentioned Hellraiser. She mentioned also the anime Monster, and it's also, of course, a manga as well. And I remember reading the manga of Monster, the Japanese manga Monster, and I remember there were some key moments, and I thought, oh, this would be so perfect to read when listening to moments of the Hellbound Hellraiser 2 soundtrack. And so what I did was I found the soundtrack, and I was listening to this. I put the soundtrack on, and I listened to the soundtrack as I was reading certain key kind of climactic moments in parts of the story. And so, talking about Monster, so I was reading the manga of Monster while listening to Hellbound Hellraiser 2 soundtrack, and in particular, it's the bit in the music where Dr. Channard, the Cenobite Channard, confronts Tiffany in hell and before Leviathan, right, and he says, "Oh, girls, and how are we feeling today? No anesthetic at hand, shame," and that sort of thing. Surgery is open, Tiffany. And what was today's agenda? Ah, yes, evisceration. Ah, ha, ha. And I love how Dr. Channard, when he laughs, it's the thing that's caught on his head, so he can't really maneuver his head very well. So he kind of has to turn his, he does that. That's such a great touch. But Kenneth Branagh, right? But what was I saying? So it's that bit in the film, that music that accompanies this moment of the film. I listened to that part of the music while I was reading the manga of Monster, Naoki Urasawa. And this, I thought it fit so well. And so when I was talking with Michelle the other day, and she was mentioning all these things, I didn't have time to talk about it, but it was just all these childhood memories suddenly flooded my mind. And I've been just thinking about them ever since. So, yeah.